Hello, welcome to everyone. I'm Meredith Winter and welcome again. Tonight we have already arrived at the fourth and final lecture in our Frank Davis Memorial Series to be delivered by Anna Näslund. My co-organizer for this series, Stephen Whiteman, will be introducing her, but I will just take a moment to reintroduce for the last time this year's series. The Frank Davis Memorial Lecture Series was first established in 1989, and every year we gather speakers here at the Court Hall to speak on a topic of significance to the field. This year, when we decided upon art history at the crossroads of computer vision, we wanted to conscientiously evaluate how technology is shaping our relationship to the past and how we use technology to show our vision of the past. We've now heard three highly distinct approaches to understanding that relationship, whether it's the rematriation of traditions using digital means of returning and rerouting artworks in Southeast Asia, of our first lecture, or in our second, the long shadows cast by early computing's understanding of visual perception on art history's digital turn, or last week when we considered the agency of seemingly tethered tools like AI as gauged through the lessons of medieval mechanical devices. And tonight's lecture gives us a fourth vision to ponder for our art history at the crossroads of computer vision, as we continue to think through how we think through the past. I will now turn it over for a proper introduction of our speaker to my co-organizer.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. My name is Stephen Whiteman, and it's such a pleasure to join Meredith and welcome you all. Tonight, we welcome Professor Anna Näslund from Stockholm, where she is Professor of Art History at Stockholm University and a researcher at the Institute for Future Studies. Trained in art history also at Stockholm, her work spans photography, pictorial culture, image archives, art historiography, and digitization. Broadly speaking, Professor Näslund's research concerns how images and other visual expressions are produced, circulated, and used and migrate between different display contexts. This interest has taken her to diverse places, including Swedish advertising and fashion photography, press photography and contemporary photo-based art, as well as 19th century vernacular photo albums and photographic archives and archival practices. Her research has been supported by a wide range of grants, including those from the Swedish Royal Academy of Letters, History and Antiquities, the Bank of Sweden Tercentenary Foundation, and the Swedish Research Council. Professor Näslund's current projects include photographic lives, intangible cultural heritage, and digital accessibility through a photographic audio archive, supported by her work with the Institute for Future Studies. Her most recent book, relating very much to the theme of this year's Frank Davis series, as does all her research, is Critical Digital Art History, co-edited with Amanda Wojcicki. Noting the frequent emphasis in scholarly literature on practical concerns of digital technology and the attendant responsibilities of art institutions vis-a-vis the digital. This volume approaches the use of digital technology in art history from critical and theoretical perspectives, while also considering the political dimensions of large-scale digitization and application of digital tools within museums and collections management. With the recent digitization of our own Witt and Conway photographic libraries, the questions raised by this important volume are of direct relevance to our work here at the Court Hall. And with that, I would like to warmly welcome Professor Anna Näslund for her lecture this evening, Picturing Digital Infrastructures.
First of all, I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to thank the Court Institute and you, the organizers, who has been inviting me here. And I'm very happy to be here to be able to talk about my research. So what I'm going to talk about today is based on three different studies which has been made within two research projects I was running between 2019 and 2023. the politics of metadata, and sharing the visual heritage. And both of these were funded by the Swedish Research Council. And both of these projects dealt with digitization, picture collections in labs, that means library, archives, and museums, and the crucial importance that metadata has for not only the retrieval of pictures, but also for our understanding of what pictures are or could be as knowledge objects. And before I continue, I should also say that if you have any questions during my talk, it's just fine to raise your hand and we can do that, or you can wait until I've finished. It's really up to you. But please don't hesitate if you have any comments or questions as we go. In both these projects, we were an interdisciplinary group, including both art historians like myself, but also a computer scientist. And one of the things that struck me while working in close collaboration with a computer scientist specialized in human-computer interaction was that she always looked at the digital interfaces, and in this case it was the online interfaces of picture collections, in terms of usability. What types of uses these interfaces enabled, facilitated, or sometimes hindered. So she was looking at websites in terms of how they organize data, while for me, a website coming from visual culture and image studies I looked at websites as pictures or designs primarily. So while keeping my interest in how websites look, a kind of digital visuality, one could say, I was also increasingly interested in what databases and online catalogs looked like as information infrastructures. So in effect, we did within this project a number of studies that looked how online interfaces presented themselves visually as information or data repositories, and we worked with visualizations of different kind. I will soon show you some examples of that. And I would describe this as a merge between art historical approaches and computer science. So this is in a sense a response to Anna Näslund's call in 2020 for humanistic approaches to interface design. And the following examples are taken from 3 studies which has been published, but we have made several other studies within this project, and you can find all of them on our project website, which is still up, metadataculture.se. And I've chosen these 3 examples from these 3 case studies because they also are examples of very different image collections. So it's one Swedish archive, a photographic archive, which also have their part of the collection at Flickr Commons. It's art museum, and it's our national library in Sweden, which also has a large picture collection. Before going into details and examples, I want to say something about some core concept when it comes to approaches and processes related to the digital. And some of this is maybe already well known to you, but for example, the term digital art history is typically used to denote the use of digital tools and methods to study artworks and other artifacts. But I would argue, based on the studies we have done within these 2 projects, and we are in the company of many other scholars here, of course, that an important aspect of what can be termed digital art history is when we as humanists approach digital phenomena with critical perspectives, taken from cultural theory. And this is concepts and perspectives that we have used for a long time within humanities. And this is what we have set out to do in these studies. Oops, sorry. Another connected concept is platformization, meaning the reorganization of cultural practices and imagination around platforms, and the connected and partly overlapping concept of datafication, meaning in this context the transformation of picture collections into quantifiable data that can be tracked, monitored, and analyzed computationally. And finally, I will also mention the 2 terms digitization and digitalization. The term digitization has been used particularly within the LAM institutions, to refer to the purely technical aspects of transforming analog images into digital reproductions, while the term digitalization refers to the manifold socio-technical phenomena and processes of adopting and using these technologies in a broader context. I don't know if you're familiar with these two terms, and they have been used very differently among scholars too, but in practice, I would argue that the technological process and applications are inseparable from the cultural and social and institutional context where it is developed and used, and the separation of technical and social and cultural is impossible. So I lean to use only the word digitalization, and by that I also include the technical aspects of transferring the analog to digital. Much of the writings on the transformation of picture collections from analog to digital in heritage institutions has focused on digitization in quantitative terms, implicating the portion of analog collections which have been made accessible digitally online. This is well monitored by national and governmental organizations, as well as by the heritage institutions themselves. A similarly large body of work has focused on the misrepresentation and biases of pictorial content as regard, for example, gender, race, geography, or class, and has drawn attention to the effects and ethical concerns related to such aspects, but also sometimes ethical problems when picture collections are transferred from analog to digital and publicly and very easily accessed online. In contrast to this, I did in these 3 studies discuss the platformization and datafication of picture collections from another perspective, where the primary focus was neither the quantitative aspect of big data nor a hitherto common bibliographic focus on visual content, but on a more foundational systemic aspect of the transition from analog to digital. So my aim was to consider how or in what ways the transformation from analog to digital changes the archive, and also to scrutinize how digitization may alter the way we conceive of picture archives and pictures as such. In consequence, I focus on something called information infrastructures of the online platform, and only indirectly on its visual and textual content. So my focus has been on the systemic and how the information, both the textual and visual, is organized, classified, and made accessible across both analog and digital platforms. And this is made with inspiration from a classic book by Booker and Starr, Sorting Things Out, Classification and Its Consequences, that was published in 1999, where they write, infrastructures are never transparent to everyone, and their workability as they scale up becomes increasingly complex. Through due methodological attention to the architecture and use of these systems, we can achieve a deeper understanding of how it is that individuals and communities meet infrastructures. Recognizing the depth of interdependence of technical networks and standards on the one hand, and the real work of politics and knowledge production on the other. So the studies we've done are inspired with this kind of approach to what classification and digitization is. As already mentioned, the process of digitization is often reported in quantitative terms as the digitization degree of analog collection, or and that could be an individual institution's collection, or it could be types or groups of institutions, or it could be nations or regions. And what you see here is an image of the statistics from the Swedish Heritage Board, who has a collection of around 4 million photographs, where 5% of the holdings are digitized and 0.5% was published on Flickr Commons when we did this study in 2023. And this is what it looks in most institutions. I realize now that the Courtaulds photographic collections are an exception. There are some more exceptions, but generally, typically, most heritage institutions in Europe have a small portion digitized, could be typically between 5 and 20% of the holdings are digitized. Naturally, this way of describing the process of digitization as a subtotal of a larger totality focuses on the numbers of entries in a database, not their individual character or quality. However, behind this way of describing digitization lies two implicit foundational ideas. First, something is or is not digitized. It's either digitized or it's not digitized. Something cannot be semi-digitized or partially digitized. However, the quality or amount of information may vary widely, as you will see soon, between different database entries, which raises the questions about what these numbers tells us. For example, do we mean that an artifact is digitized when there exists only a limited written record, like, for example, a title and the name of the originator and the year of production? Or do we mean that in order to be digitized, there has to be a photographic reproduction of the picture at hand or the artwork at hand? Second, this model implicitly says that there is a fixed totality from which a percentage can be drawn. In reality, collections of pictures are often not ordered fully, and the total number of items given for a particular institution or collection is in many cases just a qualified guess. And pictorial material also comes in very different material shapes. Illustrated books and photo albums, for example, are typically catalogued as one entity and then doesn't account for the numerous pictures they may contain. It could be up to 100 pictures in each of these items. A realistic estimate of how much of a collection is made accessible in a chosen platform is, of course, relevant, but just as relevant is how and why those particular artifacts have been made accessible. So, turning back to this tip of the iceberg image, the relations between the tip and what is below ground, so to speak, are just as crucial to map and understand. How do the items visible at the tip relate or correlate or resonate with the totality? How have they been chosen? When have they been digitized, and to what ends? And with what quality, technique, and content in mind? And the following images of visualization focus on such relations between the digitized part and the analog whole. So what I'm going to speak about today is diversity when it comes to digitizing pictures, and how this can be described in terms of relations, meaning how the digitized entries relate to the analog whole, but also form, meaning the very different looks and character of a digitized post or entry. And also about time, and how digitization can be described as a historical process. As, for example, when you look into the discourse on digitization, it appears that the digitization happens to take place in a constant present, where historiographic understanding or a focus on the historicity of the process of digitization is not always put forward. So I will start by saying some words about relations between the digital databases of the collection and the whole of this collection, with figure comments as an example. And given the size of this collection, a manual study of the totality is not possible to make in this case. However, it appears that the unusual seems to have precedence over the common, the abundantly present. And this is just a very, very simple test or example of this, taken from one of the studies we've done within the project. I just did a very simple word search, keyword search, for different photographic techniques, and this was the results. So while there were, for example, 804 daguerreotypes, 1,490 tintypes, and 1,476 ambrotypes, there were only 57 hits on silver gelatin. And I don't know if you're photo historians or photo knowledgeable in photo history, but silver gelatin has been the dominating photographic technique since the late 19th century and was completely dominating during the 20th century. So, and this is just an example, while daguerreotypes, for example, the very first photographic technique is a very quite rare, and partly simply because a daguerreotype is a unique picture, so there's no copies, there's just one of each picture. This is just an example of how the typical or very common appears so natural for the writers of metadata that they don't think that it's needed to be written out. The relation between the online database and the analog collection can be likened to what one can apprehend from the outside of a building through the windows. In this sense, the online archive can be described as an equivalent to the foundational meaning of the word archive. It comes from Greek, literally meaning the house or the building where important official documents are stored. So the online interface can be seen as a window onto parts of a much larger built interior. And going back to the example that you just saw as a table, this is a way of visualizing this. Because these windows, as it were, are not randomly placed on the archival building, the digital archival building. It seems that what is considered rare in contemporary culture or culture distant from a geographical or cultural place of the archiving institution is more likely to be showcased in the online collection. So the simple example of the daguerreotypes in the silver gelatin could be visualized like this. So we see more of the rare daguerreotypes than the very, very abundant silver gelatin pictures. So in this sense, the online image archive has more in common with the curated exhibition, and it can be, but it doesn't have to be representative of the image collection as a whole. And one could ponder if there are any recurrent patterns when it comes to identifying what the blind spots are, what is typically hidden from sight in the online windows in relation to the total analog collection. And one could speculate, but not prove until one has the full statistics of both the digital and analog collection, of course, but that the eye-catching, the rare, and the known and the named are more visible online. And that the less visible are, for example, photographs made by less famous individuals or even anonymous photographers, or photographs of ordinary things, non-sites, non-spectacular landscapes, buildings, photographs, and also on unidentified or unnamed people, the persons. So one can think about what you see online in relation to what you see, what you can see on site. And in the case of with the Swedish Heritage Board, which we looked carefully in one of these, we looked into in this one of the sub-studies we did, and how they presented themselves on Flickr Commons, we could see that there were certain things that was not communicated. So name of the photographer was always there, year of production was there, and the content was described in words. But there were some hidden aspects. For example, the institutional context was not always spelled out. So why this picture has ended up in this institution and what the entirety of the collection looked like. But also the historical context of the fonts of the images was not communicated. Why has a particular picture been produced? How has it been used and by whom historically before it came into the collection? And a third hidden element include the material aspects or context which describe the relative size of the picture, for example, the technique used to produce it, and its immediate material context in the archive. For example, when it comes to photographic, black and white photographic archive, at least in many of Swedish museums, they don't separate negatives from positives. So you see all pictures like positives, but they could as well be a negative in the collection, but it's not signaled visually or with text. Just to give a very simple example of materiality. And finally, but not least, the digitization context is maybe the most under-communicated information of all. For example, why have all the pictures in a folder been digitized, but nothing in another? Why have some pictures in one folder been digitized and not the others? When did the digitization take place? By whom was it made and to what ends? So what we've tried to do in the following example is to make these hiddens visible through a variety of methods. In one of the studies I did in collaboration with Carola Blilund within the project, we set out to look at exactly these biases within an art museum, the Swedish National Museum of Art and Design, Nationalmuseum. And we went into depth on how individual artworks were on display qualitatively in their online catalogue. Our first impression was that the posts in this online database looked very different in terms of textual and visual information given. So one of the things we did was to look into the historical processes of digitization and the publishing of entries online at Nationalmuseum between 2004 and 2021. So this is almost 20 years. And all of these data were taken from the museum's annual reports, which, well, for every year at this almost 20 years, where the numbers of digitized posts were advertised, as well as the number of photographs published in the online catalogue. And when plotted, which we did within the study, in a comprehensive diagram like this, a couple of things are readily evident. For example, one could see that the percentage of entries, including reproduction photographs, have increased over time. So in 2025, it was only a third, 32% of the entries which included a picture, while in 2019, 71% of the entries included pictures. And just to explain, there were only data of how many photographs they published a few years. So the dotted lines are just our estimate. We don't know. Which is also interesting that they don't have statistics on this yearly, but just irregularly. Moreover, it's evident that the increase in entries have changed very much over time. In some years, the increase is very steep, 2007, for example, and 2013 to 2014, while other years has almost new entries been added at all. To understand these differences, we needed to talk to the employees. So we interviewed some employees of the museum. And this revealed, for example, that the extreme rise in the amount of digital entries some years depended on state fundings with the aim of limiting unemployment within the sector, while sometimes it was the reason was that there was a research project which actually raised the number of a very focused part of the collection, digitization. And at other times, it was due to the preparation of the collection for the long-term closing during the renovation of the museum, which took part between 2014 and 2019. So that's the steep rise just before 2014 when the museum closed down. So it's not only the pace and progress of the digitization that has varied over time. When you look at the entries in the database, they look very different. They differ greatly when it comes to the amount of and nature of the information given. And worth noting is that these different types of entries are not possible to extract through keywords or filters or categories. So what you can sort out via the database is basically two things. You can find the entries which has image and those which has not image. And you can sort out the entries which has a lengthier written description and those who hasn't a written description. So this is what you could draw out of the system itself. So our method here was, again, a manual one or analog one. So we manually studied a sample of 500 entries for oil paintings in the database to get an estimate of different types of representations. And we divided these into 5 different categories, depending on the amount of information. The simplest type of database entry included only basic metadata, at minimum accession number and material, and often, but not always, the name of the artist, title, and year of production. And in the case of National Museum, these types of entries were overrepresented for portraits and landscape paintings. And although this entry lacks any photographic reproductions, it is evident that it refers to visual data through the inclusion of a light grey square with the text "no image." Thus, the graphic layout of the online page is designated to include an image, and when this element is missing, the result is not only void, but also a visual pattern that emphasizes this lack or absence of information. The second most simple type of entry included one black and white photograph and basic metadata. In these cases, the pictures of the artwork is a second-order reproduction, as it is a digitized version of an already existing black and white reproduction photograph, and not a photograph of the artwork itself. And the type of motifs or artists found in this category have much in common with the most basic entries, without images. Portrait and landscape paintings were overrepresented, and particularly landscape paintings from the 19th century. A more intermediate type of entry includes a single color photograph and basic metadata. This is what we, before doing this study, thought was going to be the most common type of entry, but it was not. Most of the photographs used in these entries were taken by professional photographers that clearly display the artwork. However, another type of photograph might also appear, and you see an example of this here. It is what the museum called identification pictures, and these are taken by the employees of the museum with smartphones, as this is a quicker and cheaper way of making photographs of the collection. And as you can see in this particular example, you see the reflection of the photographer in the glass of the painting. Maybe you cannot see it from here, but finally, there are also 2 more elaborate types of online entries. The first one includes several photographic representation, and this may include photographs presenting the painting or the artwork framed and unframed, or it could depict the reverse. It could be close-ups of specific details of a painting, or different versions of reproductions. So you can have photographs in black and white and color, and different color hues with different techniques and different quality. And finally, there was the entries which included one color reproduction photograph and a descriptive text. And this was text that has been produced to appear in the museum's audio guide or on wall text within the museum. In short, there were 5 different types of entries in this catalogue or this online database. And it was very clear that the artworks that have been conserved, researched or loaned to other museums or were on display in the museum was more elaborately described in the catalogue. So this means that the artworks that have attracted the interest of researchers or the museums, both nationally and internationally, are generally more elaborately described and documented than those had only resisted in the storage. And this also holds then for the artworks that were actually on display. So they were on display in the catalogue online, but also on display in the museum. So in some, there's a tendency that the online database reinforces already established appraisals and canons. A third case study is a study I did on the picture collection of the National Library of Sweden, Kungliga biblioteket, or KB. This case is also related to form, meaning in that it is about the ways the visual material is described. But here I'm not so interested in the diversity of how the artifacts are described, as in the case with National Museum, but rather how the institutional context frames and steers how material are made searchable. So in this case, I've studied how pictures were made retrievable and described across different information infrastructures in the National Library. So both the analog and the digital information infrastructures. The National Library holds a large collection of all types of printed material, of course. They also have many types of single pictures in the collections, photographs, drawings, prints. They have millions of pictures. This is a good example of an institution that doesn't have any numbers because a large part of their picture collection is not catalogued. But they estimate that they have millions, several millions. In a library collection, any text written on or close to an image always takes precedence over descriptions known through other sources. As pointed out by library and information scholars, library metadata is explicitly derived from the object in hand, such as a title or an author, unlike archives and museums, where metadata is created in response to what they can infer from an object. This in turn affects how pictures are possible to search and find when they end up in a library collection. If they are just there, so to speak, and not mentioned in the publication's title, for example, it's impossible to find it through the library catalogue. So a very, very simple question, find me books with illustrations, is not possible to do in this information infrastructure. The only way to find abundantly illustrated books is thus via the title. So if it includes words like albums or views, or illustrated, or lithographic, or steel print. And this is just a very typical example of this. This is a so-called view album. It was a very popular type of publication in the 19th century, and basically it is a number of pictures with bylines that is bound together with a book, as a book. And sometimes it has a very short introduction. It could be one page, like in this book, for example. It's a one-page introduction by the author Olof Abraham Eriksson, which is listed here. So this is what you see in the library database. But when you you can see that it has 10 plates. That means 10 PL. It means that it has 10 pictures. But it is basically a collection of pictures. But looking at the object itself, it's evident that the images have been produced through a collaboration between 4 different artists and photographers and 2 lithographers and 5 different printmakers and publishers. And none of these personal names or businesses' names appear in the catalogue. Neither is there any information on what the images depict. So from the title, one can deduce that the book contains images of the city of Stockholm, but that's not all, right? So for example, on this page, there's a drawing by the Swedish artist Ferdinand Tholin. It's a lithograph made by the German German artist Johann Gabriel Friedrich Poppel. And it's obvious that this kind of infrastructure misses a lot of information, because this is not only a picture of Stockholm, it's also has visual information. All of these pictures include people, for example. And in this picture, you can see fashion and dress practices, transport, and social life in 1850s Stockholm. I skip this and we'll go to this. Another very basic yet foundational and revealing example is the annotation work, which takes place in the computer lab at the National Library, called the lab. And they use a software called Label Studio to extract images from printed press, so-called segmentation. So despite this tool is designed to extract images in combined media, it is evident that how the computer scientists use this tool is based on a textual model. For example, white areas are coded as in-between spaces, as nothing. And this is completely logical in a text-oriented culture, as white is the most common and neutral background of a printed page, where both letters and images appear in other colors, most often in black. Thus, the markup of images follows this basic logic of the black text on the white background. And the background doesn't contain any information. And although white is the most common background for printed text, the particular hue of the background has no meaning, in the sense that the text conveys the same information no matter what color the letters and the background have. Hue is not vital for conveying the content of a text. In images, on the contrary, all hues and all parts of the picture bear information. The whole pictorial area of an image is meaningful, including those areas of the picture which are white. And this is a good example of this. It's a 2-page advertisement in a Swedish magazine, published in 1966. And here, on the left hand side of this advertisement, the white area has is very significant and meaningful, because advertisements in illustrated magazines have to stand out visually to catch the gaze of the reader. And by leaving a large part of the left page white, this ad breaks with a typical visual pattern. It's very rare occurrence in illustrated magazines. And I call this meaningful white. But what happens because the data scientist is doing this, it starts by training this model to find images and sort out all the backgrounds, and then on maybe 10% of the collection. And then the AI model works on its own, so to speak, to do this. What happens when white is coded as nothing is that what you end up with is what you see on the up the right-hand side, and you don't get the whole advertisement. And again, I should say something shortly about the method, because how do you understand or see this? How do you investigate this? And for me, the method I used was to do a participatory observation. So I was basically sitting side by side with the computer scientist when he was doing this segmentation work, and we were discussing, and he was talking about, why he was doing it the way he did. And this exemplifies how then, while both text and images on print material have been digitized and can, in theory, be accessed to the same extent, the process of training machine learning tools for retrieving this visual heritage is still influenced by a text-centric mindset. The library. I have two more pictures. Is it okay, or should I end there? Yeah. As pointed out by Mike Pepe, among others, the construction of databases involves the biases, desires, and fraught decisions of their architects. And this holds, of course, for both analog and digital information systems. So the primacy of the textual information before the visual in cataloging illustrated books is one example, and also the markup language of AI models used in the library lab, digital lab is another. As pointed out by Nina Lager-Westberg, archives are shaped not simply by their contents and the organizational preferences of the custodians, but also by the nature of the inquiries directed at them. Thus, an image resource designed by iconographers will be of use chiefly to other iconographers. And historically, iconography has a strong position within library information science. In the same way, the bibliographic tradition of textually biased framework, which permits both analog and digital information system, invites a bibliographic use of the holdings of images. And this means in practice that they are very focused on the content and not so focused on the originators of pictures. So what does the pictures display is in focus. So as this study of the National Library shows, databases and finding aids are on a very profound level tailored for text. And this is a kind of foundational mindset which is built into the information infrastructure. And this has, of course, effects that the images as sources of knowledge and information is made literally and figuratively quite invisible in a library collection. I have deliberately shown examples from different types of library institutions in this presentation, so libraries, museums, and archives. And libraries have been both ahead and expansive when it comes to digitization compared to museums and archives. And the focus on individual pictures and the tags, the metadata, and hyperlinks online emphasizes image content. At the same time, certain types of information are systemically downplayed. In the physical analog archive, time is always a key organizational aspect, as every document, series, or sub-archive has an accession number indicating when it entered into the collection. But this is not the same with the library collection, because they are more working with content and text, which is not, the content of a book is not dependent of the story told in a book or a paper, sorry, that was a bad example, but a book, of the different editions of the book, for example. And this underlines a slight distinction in that library and digital objects description is made to be atomized and remixed and matched in whatever order the user finds useful. While archival metadata may enable the same remixing, but wants the context and the structure to stick with the metadata and its associated objects. And I was happy to see that the portal online interface actually keeps, this kind of structure or context, in the sense that you can look on folders and binders and archives, which is, for example, not possible in an interface like Flickr Commons. And this might be opening up a larger debate because libraries has not only been early adopters in digitization practices and efforts. I argue that the systemic thinking of the library dominates online databases And the bibliographic take on picture dominates online repositories and other databases too. And the bibliographic tradition, which has dominated library works with pictures since the 19th century, typically renders a strong focus on image content rather than on different types of contextual information. The same kind of contextual information is at core in museum collections, yet they also have a strong focus on the materiality of items in the collection. And again, I was very happy to see that the materiality is also part of the cultural database online. So the focus on visual content of pictures has in turn implication. It turns photographic images primarily to repositories of content. And this is an example of the commodification of photographic images, or even the commodification of fragments of photographic images as parts of photographs becomes the end product. In effect, it is an image of a face or a dress rather than a portrait or a mugshot. And when we did workshops within this project, we included data scientists, computer scientists, and historians and art historians, and it was really interesting to see that the computer scientists were mainly focusing on the kind of details like you have this. Is it a face? Is it a hat? And this is, of course, the techniques that they are developing and using called object detection models, where you're actually supposed to kind of find details, content in images. So the primary function or meaning of a photographic image is then an accumulation of visual content, and pictures can be mined in the same way as text are mined for details or words, fragments. As a consequence, the image surface as a unified whole is not the only way of understanding photographic images. A photograph can be digitized in a technical sense to appear online, but it can also be conceptually digital, just as an image rather equals a list of visual details, fragments, a list of things, an archive of visual content in itself. So the single image is a kind of visual database in itself. Thank you.